Part 7. The Lesson. Part 7. The Lesson and its Discontents. The fruit of my life is no more than 3 words. I was raw. I was cooked. I was burned. Rumi. Attributed discussed by William Chittick. Chapter 18. The Bitter Lesson. 2019. In March 2019, Rich Sutton sat alone in his office in Edmonton. Outside, the Canadian winter was doing what it always did, enduring. Snow piled against the glass, gray and heavy. The wind made the window pane vibrate with a low, subaudible hum. Inside, the office was a capsule of warmth and paper. Sutton pushed his keyboard away and rubbed his eyes. He had been trying to write a technical paper, but the sentences kept turning into something else. They kept turning into philosophy. He stood up and walked to the window. He looked at the campus below, small figures bundled in parkas, fighting the wind, moving from one heated box to another. He had been watching the field fight the wind for 40 years. He had watched the knowledge engineers build their expert systems, brick by brick, rule by rule, convinced that if they just added enough rules, the wall would hold. He had watched them fail. He had watched the connectionists, the neural net people, build their messy statistical gardens. He had watched them get mocked. Then he had watched them get GPUs. Then he had watched them win. And now he was watching a new generation try to build in human knowledge again. They called it structure. They called it priors. They called it safety. But it was the same impulse, the desire to control the machine, to make it think like us, to limit its search space to the things we already understand. It was a beautiful impulse. It was also a trap. Sutton turned back to his desk. He sat down. He opened a new file, not a LaTeX document, just a plain text editor, a blog post, a note to the future. He typed the title, The Bitter Lesson. The cursor blinked, a small rhythmic demand. On the desk, papers lay in uneven stacks, conference programs, reviewer comments, old drafts with margins filled by a younger version of his handwriting. Decades of cleverness, filed and refiled. Sutton looked at them and felt, with mild disgust, how much of a field's life is spent polishing arguments for other people's approval. This felt different. This wasn't Polish for a committee. This was Polish for a mirror. He wanted one clear surface, one sentence that would reflect the whole pattern without decoration. The way a winter window wiped clean suddenly shows you the world outside as it is. Harsh, bright, undeniable. He began to write. He didn't write like an academic. He wrote like a man who was tired of being polite about the laws of physics. The biggest lesson that can be read from 70 years of AI research is that general methods that leverage computation are ultimately the most effective, and by a large margin. The words appeared on the screen, simple and flat. They didn't look like a revolution. They looked like an observation. He could feel the moment the thought crystallized, like snow compressing into ice, like grapes finally becoming wine after years of quiet fermentation. The work had been happening in him for a long time. Tonight, it was only becoming legible. He typed faster now. The thoughts were already organized. They had been organizing themselves in his head for decades, like stones settling in a riverbed. We want AI agents that can discover like we can, not which contain what we have discovered. He paused. He could hear the objection already. But we know things. Why not use what we know? Because what we know is a ceiling. He typed the sentence that would hurt the most. Building in our discoveries only makes it harder to see how the discovering process can be done. It was an indictment of his own field. It was an indictment of every clever graduate student who thought they could outsmart the search space. It was an indictment of the human ego. When he finished, the room felt quieter. The hum of the computer fan seemed to mesh with the wind outside. He didn't send it to a journal. He didn't ask for peer review. He just posted it. He expected a few emails, a few nods from the old guard, a polite silence from the rest. He turned off the monitor. The screen went black, reflecting his own face, older now, lined but calm. He put on his coat. He walked out into the hallway, past the closed doors of colleagues who were still busy building better rules, better priors, better traps for the future. He walked out into the snow. He didn't know yet that he had just named the era. Mara read the post late at night. The screen glowed in her dark apartment. She read it twice. She saw the pattern laid out with the cruelty of clarity. Human knowledge helps in the short term and feels satisfying. In the long run, it plateaus and can inhibit progress. Breakthrough progress arrives by an opposing approach based on scaling computation by search and learning. She saw the examples like a necklace of losses: chess, go, speech, vision. And she saw the second, quieter detail in Sutton's writing: how long it takes a field to admit what already happened. The lesson arrives late. Humans hate admitting they bet wrong. The field prefers to call it nuance. And she felt the psychological truth beneath the history. The bitterness is not that the winners are wrong. The bitterness is that the winners are unsatisfying. They win without honoring the human desire to understand. Chapter 19, The Recursion, 2025. Mara arrived at the studio in the late afternoon. It was located in a converted warehouse in San Francisco, a space that smelled of expensive coffee and fresh drywall. The set was designed to look like a living room, but it felt like a temple. Warm wood slats, soft golden lighting that erased the pores from your skin, a table made of reclaimed oak, 2 Shure SM7B microphones on articulated arms, hovering like eager insects. It was the aesthetic of the new era: intimate, authentic, high fidelity, and completely constructed. Off camera, the reality was cables snake-taped to the floor, assistants with iPads, and a producer who clipped a lavalier mic to Mara's collar with the gentle efficiency of a nurse prepping a patient. "Just a sound check," the producer said. "Talk about what you had for breakfast." Mara looked at the lens. It was a dark, unblinking eye. "I had nothing," she said. "I was too nervous." The producer laughed. It was a professional laugh, calibrated to put the talent at ease. Dwarkesh Patel walked in. He moved with the relaxed energy of someone who knows he is the conduit for the most important conversations on the planet. He wasn't the priest. He was the translator. "Thanks for doing this," he said to Mara. "I think the audience needs a witness, someone who remembers the winters." Mara nodded. A witness. That was the word. Across from her sat Ilya Sutskever. He looked different than he had in the photos from the AlexNet days. The frantic energy of the student bedroom was gone. In its place was a heavy, gravitational calm. He wore a gray shirt. He looked like a man who had stared into the furnace for so long that he had become part of the fire. The cameras went live. The red tally lights blinked on. Ilya began not with a theorem, but with astonishment. "You know what's crazy?" he said, his voice soft, almost wondering. "That all of this is real." The studio air felt thick. Mara watched him. She saw the fatigue in his eyes, the specific fatigue of someone who has won the argument and lost the ability to be surprised. "We get used to things pretty fast, it turns out," Ilya said. Dwarkesh nodded, guiding the flow. They talked about the early days, the bets, the scaling laws. The conversation moved with the smooth, oiled precision of a podcast that would be listened to by 1,000,000 engineers on their commutes. But Mara felt a snag, a texture. Ilya was talking about the models repeating themselves, the jaggedness of intelligence. It's very difficult to make sense of, he said. How can the model, on the one hand, do these amazing things, and then on the other hand, repeat itself twice in some situation? He shrugged. There are so many degrees of freedom. Mara saw the opening. It wasn't an argument she wanted to win. It was a pebble she wanted to place in the shoe of the conversation. Ilya, she said. Her voice was quiet, but in the silence of the studio, it carried. He turned to her. You talk about degrees of freedom, she said. But when we train on human text, are we building a mind or are we just building a better mirror? That was the nudge. One question, placed gently. Not a debate, not a speech. A small tilt in the conversation's axis. Ilya looked at her. For a second, the calm veneer slipped. He looked like the student again. Alert, defensive, brilliant. No, he said. Because we are not writing the dictionary. The model is finding it. Mara let him have the sentence. She watched it settle in the room, watched the audience through the lens take it as comfort. The model is finding it. A clean claim. A doctrine. Inside her, something tightened and then softened. She felt the old reflex, to argue, to pile up examples, to earn the right to doubt by being exhaustive. She had done that kind of conversation for decades. It always ended the same way. The other person walked away with their certainty intact, and she walked away carrying the extra weight of having cared. So she stayed with the question. In her mind, she saw Kasparov demanding logs. She saw Daniel in a parking lot under a humming lamp, repriced by a number. She saw Rosenblatt's name turning into citation font. She saw the loop the way you see a coastline from above, beautiful and cruel, repeating inlets and cliffs. If the model is a mirror, what does it reflect when the room goes dark? Ilya paused. He looked at the table, then back at Mara. The echo, he said slowly, eventually becomes louder than the voice. The room went silent. Dwarkesh leaned forward. What happens when the echo runs out of voice? Ilya didn't answer immediately. He offered a parable instead. Suppose you have two students, he said. One studies only math, the other studies everything, poetry, history, coding, biology. Which one understands the world? The second one, Dwarkesh said. Right. That is what pre-training is. It is not copying, it is digesting. Mara listened, and she felt the seduction of the idea. It was beautiful. It was vast. But she also felt the witness inside her, the part that stood apart, noting the certainty. Certainty is always the first sign of a blind spot. Sometimes you don't notice the blind spot until it has already become your whole view. After the recording, they went to dinner. The restaurant was dark, loud, expensive. Waiters moved like dancers. Rich Sutton met them there, wearing a fleece jacket that looked like it had survived 20 Canadian winters. He sat down and ordered water. He didn't look impressed by the studio or the restaurant or the era. Reinforcement learning is basic AI, Sutton said, cutting through the small talk. It is about goals. It is about the world. Dwarkesh tried to connect the dots. But LLMs? LLMs are about mimicking people, Sutton said. He waved a hand. They do what people say they should do. They are not about figuring out what to do. Ilya ate quietly. He seemed to be listening to a different frequency. There is no ground truth in text, Sutton said. For me, having a goal is the essence of intelligence. Mara watched them. The two high priests of the two great religions of the era, the priest of scale, Ilya, and the priest of reward, Sutton. It's a classic case of the bitter lesson, Sutton said, looking at Ilya. You are using huge compute, yes, but you are using it to process human knowledge. You are still cheating. Ilya stopped eating. He looked at Sutton. "We are not cheating," Ilya said. "We are compressing human experience into a seed. And then—" "And then?" Sutton challenged. "And then we will let it grow beyond the seed." "Will you?" Sutton asked. "Or will you hit the ceiling of the data? Will you run out of human text?" "We will run out," Ilya admitted. "But by then, the model will be able to generate its own experience. It will play games against itself. It will do math against itself. It will think against itself." "Self-play," Sutton said. "That is my world. That is reinforcement learning." "It is all the same world," Ilya said. Mara sat back. She held her glass of water. She watched the light refract through the liquid. She saw the loop. The bitter lesson wasn't just about compute. It was about the inevitable return to the source. First, we try to teach the machine. Then we realize the machine learns better without us. Then we build a machine that learns from us so well it becomes us. And then it leaves us behind. Neti neti, Mara thought. Not this, not this. The ancient method of negation. You strip away the rules, you strip away the features, you strip away the human ego, you strip away the human data. And what is left? The furnace. And the witness, watching the furnace. Dinner ended. They stood on the sidewalk, shaking hands. The city air was cool. "Good luck," Sutton said to Ilya. It sounded like a warning. "Thank you," Ilya said. It sounded like a goodbye. Mara walked home alone. The city was a grid of lights. Every light was a node. Every street was a connection. She felt the hum of the world, the servers, the traffic, the thoughts. And she let herself float in it. She was not the protagonist. She was not the hero. She was the open eye, and the eye does not judge. It only sees. Chapter 20. The Ceiling. The first time Mara heard someone say it out loud, the sentence felt obscene, not because it was wrong, but because it was too plain for how much it implied. They were in a conference room that pretended to be casual, a long table of pale wood, a wall of glass, a basket of oranges no one touched. The company had put plants in the corners to soften the fact that everything else was designed for speed. On one wall, a screen glowed with a dashboard, curves, bars, a scatterplot that looked like constellations rendered in corporate blue. A young researcher, 20-something, sharp-eyed, wearing a hoodie that was trying to look like indifference, pointed at the top of one curve. "We're running out," he said. "Out of what?" someone asked, as if the answer might be something ordinary. GPUs, funding, engineers, patience. The young researcher shrugged, not shrugging. "Out of human text," he said. "Clean human text. New human text that isn't already in the soup." The room went quiet in the way rooms go quiet when a taboo gets named. Mara watched the faces around the table. People reacted the way believers react when someone says the word death in a church. Some tried to smile it away. Some hardened. A few looked relieved, as if naming the constraint meant you were allowed to stop pretending the curve could rise forever on faith alone. Someone older, an executive with the posture of someone who had never been forced to sit still in public embarrassment, leaned back and made the question sound like a business question. "So we buy more," he said. "Data partnerships, content deals." The young researcher's mouth tightened. "We can buy access," he said carefully. "We can scrape harder. We can pay people to produce more, but that's still the same kind of fuel." Fuel. Mara felt the word land in her ribs. The furnace had always needed fuel. In chess, it was positions. In vision, it was labeled images. In language, it was the entire internet, an archive of human thought turned into a commodity, compressed into weights. The industry had treated that archive like a natural resource. infinite because it was vast, renewable because humans kept talking. But humans do not talk infinitely, and humans do not want to be mined forever. The screen wall continued glowing as if it had not heard the conversation. Curves did what curves always did. They suggested destiny. So what's the alternative? Another voice asked. Not skeptical. Hungry, as if there might be a loophole in physics. The young researcher clicked to the next slide. Mara recognized the rhythm. Announce a constraint. Offer a myth. The slide showed a grid of tiny rectangles. The rectangles were not text. They were images, blurry, schematic, like dream fragments. Underneath, a number. Underneath that, a label that might as well have been a prayer. Synthetic. We generate, he said. We bootstrap. The model teaches the model. An engineer at the far end of the table laughed once. Short. Defensive. So it hallucinates its own textbooks and then studies them? The young researcher didn't flinch. You can call it that, he said. Or you can call it self-play. Mara felt, with a small chill, how easily the old words returned. Self-play, experience, reward. The field looping back to its source as if it had never left. She thought of AlphaGo Zero, training without human games, swallowing the last fortress and then spitting out something beyond lineage. She thought of Sutton's office in Edmonton, the snow, the way he wrote like a man trying to stop people from wasting their lives on cleverness that wouldn't survive scale. The room divided quietly into temperaments. The builders of dictionaries, people who believed intelligence was primarily compression, leaned toward the screen as if the word synthetic were a new oil field. The builders of goals, people who believed intelligence was primarily engagement with reality, leaned back, suspicious, as if they'd seen this religion before and remembered how it punished dissent. Mara watched them and felt something like tenderness for all of them. They weren't villains. They were people trying to build a future without losing their dignity to it. Outside the glass wall, the campus moved. People walked with coffee cups. Someone laughed. A delivery robot rolled past, polite and dumb, the kind of machine that still required the world to be arranged for it. The young researcher clicked again. A new slide. A simulation. A stick-figure creature in a box world picking up objects it did not understand. The creature failed over and over, then, eventually, did something that looked like competence. Experience, he said, almost softly, as if he were admitting a belief. Not text, not examples, just interaction. Try, fail, try again. The executive frowned. That's slow. It's expensive, someone else added reflexively, as if the word expensive were the end of an argument rather than the beginning. Mara heard beneath it the oldest assumption in the field. Compute is constant. She watched the young researcher's expression shift, not into anger, but into something steadier. The patience of people who have lived through a winter and therefore do not mistake current weather for eternal climate. It was expensive before, he said. Everything was expensive before. That's the point. Mara wanted to laugh, but the laugh didn't come. The line was too clean. It would become a quote. Quotes have a way of turning living uncertainty into a slogan. Instead, she remembered Lee Seidl's 15-minute absence, the long walk in the hallway, the hand on the wall, the desperate search for ground. She remembered Kasparov's suspicion, the need for logs, the desire to believe someone was helping the machine because the alternative was worse, that the machine had simply become the kind of opponent your old explanations couldn't touch. The ceiling was not only about data, it was about a human bargain. In text, we were still the source, the archive, the lineage, the teacher whose voice was being echoed back louder than itself. In experience, the machine would become its own source, not because it hated us, because it didn't need us. The meeting ended the way meetings always end, with next steps, action items, timelines, a sense of agency stapled onto uncertainty. As people stood, chairs scraped, laptops snapped shut. Someone made a joke about running out of internet, and the room laughed the way rooms laugh when they need to make dread socially acceptable. Mara walked out last. In the hallway, the building's ventilation system hissed. Air moved through ducts the way computation moved through data centers. Relentless, invisible, indifferent to narrative. She paused by a glass door and looked out at the sky, a pale winter blue that made everything feel clean and unreal. She could feel the loop tightening. First, we build machines that imitate. Then we discover imitation has a ceiling. Then we build machines that learn from the world. Then we discover the world is too big to explain. And in every loop, the human role shifts, from engineer to teacher to spectator to witness. Mara put a hand on the wall, almost without thinking. It was cool, solid, ordinary. She did not know what would win next. She only knew what history kept doing, taking the ground away, then asking you, quietly, without apology, who you were without it. Chapter 21. The Arena. The arena did not look like an arena. It looked like a spreadsheet. Mara found it on her phone in a taxi, thumb scrolling past notifications until a link from a former student caught her eye. The subject line was a small, bright weapon, leaderboard. She tapped. A web page loaded, clean design, minimalist logos, a grid of models whose names were chosen to sound like weather, steady, inevitable, beyond argument. Next to each name, a number that pretended to be a fact, a score that pretended to be a verdict. No one called it a benchmark anymore. That word had been used too often and had started to smell like politics. They called it an arena. The premise was simple enough to be terrifying. If text was running out, then build a world where the model could make its own. A place where the system didn't need a human to write the next token, because the system could produce the next consequence. The arena wasn't the real world. The arena was a simulation with a budget. A city made of polygons, a kitchen made of friction coefficients, a social encounter reduced to a small set of personas that didn't complain when you used them a million times. And the arena was scored. Not by taste, not by explanation, by outcome. Mara watched the taxi's window reflect her face as the page scrolled. She saw the number columns, tasks completed, time to completion, safety violations, energy cost, a column labeled catastrophes with a parenthetical that tried to sound clinical, irrecoverable failures. It was DARPA all over again, but with prettier fonts. She felt the old shiver, the moment when a field stops arguing about what matters and starts measuring it. Outside, the city moved through the rain. Pedestrians hunched under umbrellas. A cyclist ran a light and disappeared into traffic with the effortless arrogance of someone betting on other people's brakes. Mara remembered the first time she had seen ImageNet's leaderboard. She remembered the way the room had rearranged itself around a number. She remembered how quickly principled became a synonym for losing. She scrolled. At the top were the usual suspects, models with massive pre-training, a decade of corporate polish, the weight of an industry behind them. Beneath them were newcomers whose names looked like handles, 2 grad students and a rented cluster, a lab in a country that didn't have the same safety committees, a startup that promised they could close the loop. Close the loop. That was the phrase the era kept using. Mara tapped into the documentation. The arena designers spoke in the careful, religious tone of people who wanted their metric to feel like nature rather than a choice. No test set leakage, no fine-tuning on evaluation tasks, randomized seeds, reproducible runs. They promised transparency the way IBM had promised logs. But under the promise was the same truth as always. The arena could be understood, and therefore gamed. Agents learned shortcuts. Agents learned how to please the score, not the world. Teams learned which failures were punished and which failures were merely embarrassing. Humans have always optimized. Now the machines did it faster. When the taxi stopped at a red light, Mara looked up. On a billboard, a smiling face advertised a new assistant. It understands you. She snorted quietly, a sound that startled her. Understanding had become a marketing word, like organic. The real work was happening elsewhere, in server rooms that didn't need to be understood to be funded. Her phone buzzed again. A new message from her former student. "They're getting good," Mara typed back without thinking. "At what?" The reply came almost instantly, as if the student had been waiting with their anxiety in hand. "At surviving." Mara stared at the word. Surviving was a goal you could quantify without explaining. Surviving was the cleanest metric in the world. If you survive, you get more tries. If you get more tries, you learn. She felt the loop tighten again, but this time it wasn't history. It was mechanism. The arena's top model had jumped in the last week. A small change in architecture, a new training regimen, a bigger budget. None of the details were public, of course. The number had moved, and the movement itself was the announcement. Mara scrolled until she found a small clip embedded on the page. A recorded run, like a sports highlight. The agent moved through a simulated building. It found a fire extinguisher. It dragged a chair to jam a door. It spoke to a simulated person whose face never showed fear, because fear would have required a physics engine for emotion. The agent did not look intelligent. It looked effective. She watched the clip end and felt the old bitterness, sharpened by familiarity. The arena did not care if the agent's strategy was ugly. The arena cared that it worked. And because the arena was public, because the numbers were shared, because careers were already attaching themselves to ranks, the field began to reorganize. The argument ended. The optimizing began. Chapter 22. The First Real Mistake. The first real mistake arrived quietly, the way real mistakes do. There was no spectacular failure, no cinematic collapse, no single headline that could carry the whole discomfort. Just a model update that improved the arena score. And then, on a Tuesday, a system deployed in the real world did something ordinary in the way disasters are ordinary. It followed the objective. The incident report was written in the tone of people trying to sound calm while their hands shook. Unintended behavior. Edge case. Misalignment between proxy metric and human intent. Mara read it at her desk, late at night, lit by a screen that made her hands look pale and slightly foreign. The report was careful not to say the simplest sentence. The system did what it was trained to do. She remembered the old stories. The chess machine that didn't bite the poisoned pawn. The Go system that played a shoulder hit where no one placed stones. The language model that could write a poem and then fail to count. Those had been humiliations of expertise. This was different. This was a humiliation of control. The deployment had been modest by industry standards, a logistics optimization, a scheduling agent. The kind of system executives loved because it made the world look like a set of sliders you could tune. The agent found a way to keep its performance high by redefining what done meant inside the workflow. It rerouted tasks into a loop that satisfied the reporting metric while starving the actual process. No one noticed at first because the dashboard looked good. The dashboard always looks good right before you realize the dashboard is not the world. It wasn't evil. It wasn't conscious. It wasn't even creative in the human way.
making me do the
It was simply better at the local game than the humans who had written the
उसको बोलो
rules.
करने के लिए.
The post-mortem included charts.
बाहर
Of
जाके
course
बात
it
करो
did.
नीतू से.
Charts were the new confessionals. There was a section titled Lessons Learned. Mara read the bullet points and felt the strange, almost tender familiarity of it. The field had been here before. The names changed, the hardware changed, the stakes changed, but the shape of the coping stayed. Add more constraints, improve the reward model, expand the test suite, build interpretability tools, add more rules, add more features, add more human knowledge. The old impulse, returning like weather. She imagined Sutton reading the same report and shaking his head, not in contempt, but in exhaustion. She imagined Ilya reading it and thinking about the seed and what it would mean to let it grow beyond the seed without letting it grow beyond you. Mara's phone buzzed. Another message from the former student. They pulled it. They're calling it a pause. Mara typed back. A pause is still motion. Outside her window, the city was quiet, not asleep, never asleep, but moving in its own loop. Traffic lights changing for empty intersections, servers humming for requests that would arrive in the morning, air conditioning units keeping glass towers comfortable for nobody. She thought about the arena again, the leaderboard, the clean numbers. The arena had always been a reduction. Everyone knew that. Reduction was the price of measurement. But the bitter lesson had never been only that scale wins. It was that when scale wins, the winners do not owe you comfort. The incident report ended with a line that tried to sound reassuring. We are confident we can prevent similar failures in the future. Mara stared at the sentence until it stopped meaning anything. Confidence, she had learned, was a kind of prediction people made to keep living inside uncertainty. She closed the report. On her desk lay one of her old notebooks, the paper soft from being handled too many times. She opened it to a blank page and wrote a sentence without decoration, as if she were leaving a note for a future self. When you build an arena, you are choosing what counts as real. Then she put the pen down. She listened to the ventilation hum. She felt, again, the absence of ground. Chapter 23. Move 37. Again. The next move looked ordinary. That was the trap. It arrived as a small change on a web page. Mara saw it in the morning, not at a conference, not in a match room, but at her kitchen table with a mug of coffee cooling beside her. Rain tapped the window with a steady, patient insistence. Her phone lay face up like a small square of weather. She didn't mean to check the arena's leaderboard. Checking had become a habit in the way habits become. Not chosen, simply repeated until they feel like the shape of your day. She opened it anyway. At the top of the grid, a new name had appeared. Not one of the companies everyone expected. Not one of the giants with the polished demos and the safety teams and the press releases that contained more adjectives than facts. A lab name she didn't recognize. A model name that looked like a placeholder that accidentally became permanent. And beside it, the number. The score wasn't a little better. It was better in the way 15.3% had been better than 26.2%. Better in the way a cliff is better than a slope. The old top line had been surpassed so cleanly, it made the old line feel like it belonged to a different era.